The following recap contains depictions of sexual harassment that may be upsetting for some readers. Viewer discretion is advised. Eliano's father was a duke in the Vianteka Empire. Her family was very popular within the empire. Since her father was powerful, she became the jewel of the society. Every man's dream girl. What more could she have asked for? Definitely not a controlling father. Apparently, it turned out that she wasn't immune to her father's power, and he controlled her life as he wished, even to the extent of choosing a husband for her. Imagine that. Eliano was devastated. She was really worried. The man her father wanted her to marry came from the imperial family of Jakador, who had a habit of marrying multiple wives. But her father thought her concerns were only cynical. Besides, her arranged groom was only imperial in name with no power to marry several wives. To him, he believed the prince was only a pretty face with no claim to the throne whatsoever. None of this reassured Eliano. In fact, she was more worried her arranged husband might get killed for being irrelevant to the throne. In Jakador, if a prince didn't become the emperor, he could get killed by the ruling emperor. And so, marrying into the imperial family was like gambling with your life. Poor Eliano. She didn't want to go to Jakador, and she begged her father to change his mind. But he reassured her that no one would harm her because her marriage was an arranged marriage to broker peace between two nations. Eliano wasn't convinced by any of his reassuring comments, but that didn't matter because her father was done taking care of her. It was her turn to return the favor. She was left without a choice but to give in. And so began her story. The marriage was lavish. Everyone who saw Eliano thought she was beautiful. They thought the prince was lucky to have a bride as graceful as her. The prince, too, seemed to be aware of his luck because he fell in love with her at first sight. And so, Eliano got married to Marcel Jakador, the seventh prince of the Jakador Empire. Even though she came from a foreign land for a marriage she didn't want, Eliano's heart began to lean towards her husband. And he loved her so passionately. What had she been afraid for? And so in turn, she fell in love with Marcel. In all of this, Eliano was like a child. Naive and trusting, perhaps. Too trusting. Her ignorance began to lift only after her husband's name started popping up in conversations about the succession of the emperor. The sitting empress lost her only child and decided to adopt Marcel as her own. Everything changed for Marcel afterwards. Everyone seemed to respect and support him all of a sudden. Every victory, every miracle, was attributed to his efforts. Even the Pope of the Nymphs gave him his special blessings. Marcel tried to remain modest in the face of all the accolades, but secretly, he enjoyed the feeling of being revered by his people. He figured that if he could become a real imperial prince, then he could become the emperor as well. He declared his intention to Eliano, promising her all the riches and glory the world had to offer once he became the emperor. But Eliano was content with his love. She placed her husband's ambition above her own safety. She wanted him to have everything, even if it meant she was left with nothing. The Rosanna family gave Marcel financial support, and Eliano made her own sacrifices as well. Once Marcel finally became the emperor, he was to make Eliano his empress in compensation of all her efforts and family's contributions. But this was bound to never happen, simply because she was from the enemy country, Vianteka. While Marcel went on to become the crown prince and next in line for the throne, the peace treaty between both kingdoms broke down. Conflict and war broke out between them, and Eliano had to make a difficult choice. The prince's cabinet suggested for him to marry into another family. Some agreed, but others insisted that the royal blood of Jakador was never to mix with Vianteka's. Eliano wasn't initially interested in becoming empress, but at some point she came to desire it. Not as an ambition, but as a symbol of love. Her love for the prince. Marcel took her into their chambers and asked if she really wanted to be the empress. Eliano was thrown off balance by his question. She was his wife. Didn't that obviously make the title hers automatically? She told him that she wanted to, and he asked for her reason. She pointed out firmly that she loved him and asked how he would want her to be a mistress and not the empress. But Marcel was quick to explain that she was going to become an imperial wife, with more rights in the kingdom and not an ordinary mistress. But Eliano wasn't convinced. She wanted to be a partner, his empress and nothing less. Otherwise, she was content to return back to Vianteka. With tears in her eyes, she asked him if he still loved her and told her she was the only one he loved. Eventually. Eliano became the Empress of Jakador, just like she wanted, but there's always a price for the crown. And as the Empress of Jakador, everything finally changed for Eliano. Marcel's first move as emperor was to take extra imperial wives in the name of getting their support. First on his list was the Duchess Bane. Would he still stay loyal to Eliano like he promised? Eliano couldn't object. She accepted his wishes, but it didn't end there. She resigned to fate as well. The Duchess of Ban wasted no time to honor Marcel's invitation. Even Eliano put up her best hospitality and welcomed her warmly, just to please her husband. Initially, Marcel made a show of respecting Eliano, but that didn't last. Not so surprisingly, he soon became very bold about bringing women into the palace. Another unfortunate turn of events made things even worse for Eliano. She couldn't have children of her own. Fathers began offering their daughters to the emperor, and Marcel was more than glad to oblige their offers. How insensitive of him! As more women moved into the emperor's home, conflict started to spread among them. To survive, Eliano had to sacrifice the love she held so dearly in her heart. Poor thing. Even so, Marcel broke this love himself on some occasions. He stood up for the other wives even when they were obviously defying Eliano to spite her. He never even cared that they broke special rules, held sacred by the people. He seemed to forget the excuses they had to give were experiences she'd endured for him in the past. Isn't that cruel? But she'd done nothing wrong. She'd only done her duty as Empress after all. Eliano wanted so hard to believe that the love she shared with Marcel was still intact. But deep down, she knew their love had gone cold, and it would never rekindle. At least not for Marcel. Her close circle of noble ladies all consoled her. They told her how it was normal for a man's love to fade out with time. But Eliano wanted things to work. She wanted to spark things up between her and her husband again. The noble ladies suggested she invite him over to her palace, but Marcel had long since stopped paying her any visits. So that was out of the question. One of the ladies suggested she get into his bed instead, since no man could kick a woman out of his bed. Another agreed. But Eliano didn't agree with them. She was an empress after all, and not some cheap mistress. The noble ladies maintained their suggestion. Having a son for the king was a way of securing her future with him. If she couldn't get his love by being a good wife, then she could get it by having his seed. What was really the difference between the two? Eliano had to swallow her pride and face the harsh reality before her. And as expected, Marcel was more than willing to visit her once she showed interest in him. Such a scumbag. However, whenever Eliano stood up to him, he'd get violent with her and threaten not to visit her again. She needed him more than he needed her after all. He refused to heed her request for modesty, demanding love from her wherever he wanted, even out in the open. He was no longer the man she married. She could see it now. And when he tried to force himself on her, she fought back and broke away. She'd rather be called sterile than be stripped of her title and die. Marcel slapped her hard across her face at her defiance. He roared in her face, accusing her of not loving him anymore and how she only wanted his seed. In his opinion, Eliano wasn't supposed to stop loving him, whether or not he still loved her. After all, he'd fought for her to become empress when everyone else was against her. All these reasons justified his cruel actions as far as he was concerned. Eliano lay in shock as he took advantage of her. He even had the nerve to say her tears still looked like jewels to him. In that moment, Eliano felt the last bit of love she had for him vanish. But she still had to endure his cruelty and give him what he wanted. In order to survive. In order to have a child. One day, she got paid a visit from home. Flint Howard of Vianteca. He apologized for sneaking into her chambers and assured her that the offer he'd come with was worth the intrusion. Flint Howard was the Northern Grand Duke of Vianteca Empire. Eliano was surprised by his unannounced visit. He'd snuck into her palace and held her maid hostage. Eliano was livid. Did he really think he was acceptable? She asked if her family had sent him to get revenge for her decision to shun them in the past. Or was it the whole of Vianteca coming for her head? Duke Howard shocked her by revealing that Vianteca never wanted anything from her to begin with. But Eliano didn't believe him. Did he take her for a fool? She'd turned her back on the Empire after all, and to cap it all off, she was sterile. All their faith in her was gone, and she knew it. But Vianteca seemed to know otherwise. Vianteca was bigger than just the Rosana family. The Duke said that he had come to take her back home. Eliano was in disbelief. The Duke persisted. He offered her a life of comfort in her homeland. He revealed that it was the wish of Damien Rosanna. Everyone knew the story of Grand Duke Flint Howard. Eliano knew. He was a close friend and a protector of the Crown Prince Herreus. He was praised by everyone in Vianteca for being a great warrior, but no man can ever outgrow his past. Flint Howard's grandfather, Crown Prince Alphonse, died just before he could claim the throne, leaving his brother Leopold to inherit the crown in his place. When Jakador conquered their land, Emperor Leopold gave his brother's son, Maximilian Howard, as a prize to the enemy. Flint was born there shortly after Maximilian's death. The long list of tragic events didn't end there, because shortly after, Flint's mother died too. And so he became an orphan, neglected in Ringen. He endured a restless and unstable childhood. Everyone thought he was unlucky. If only his grandfather hadn't died, he just might have become crown prince. If Prince Alphonse hadn't died, Leopold would never have become king. Everyone thought there was something fishy about the older prince's death, but they did nothing about it. Instead, they mocked him for it by calling him the unlucky crown prince. Flint Howard declared his mission to Eliano again. He'd come to take her back to Vianteca. He figured she had to be tired of living in the chaos of Jakador. He promised her that if she came home with him, he'd offer her a life of comfort. But it was all courtesy of Damien Rosanna, and that was one thing Eliano wasn't so okay with. She picked up her cup of tea from the table and splashed the hot liquid on Flint in anger. How dare he mock her in such a manner? As far as she was concerned, it was only a ploy to take her back home in order to launch an invasion against Jakador. And it had to be Damien's idea. Did he promise Flint something? A path to the throne, perhaps? One thing was certain for Eliano. She would rather throw herself at the Emperor's mercy than trust Damien Rosanna. Flint warned Eliano. Marcel Jakador was not a man to be trusted, but Eliano was adamant. She trusted her husband so much and warned Flint to watch the way he spoke about him. Flint promised her that she would be safe anyway, but Eliano trusted no promises. Seeing that her mind was made up, Flint made her promise to think over his proposal with a clear mind. He promised to keep her safe if she came with him, not in Damien's name, but in his name. He swore by himself. He gave her an ultimatum of 3 days and a place to find him whenever she made up her mind. But he might as well have spoken his words to a rock because Eliano rejected his offer outright, ordering him to leave her chambers. On his way out, he reminded Eliano that he'd offered her peace. With Grand Duke Howard gone, the chief fell to her face and pleaded with Eliano. She begged her mistress to choose what was best for herself. She equally promised to devote her life to ensuring Eliano's safety if she decided to leave, even till her death. Eliano realized at that moment that her maid was a loyal woman. She hadn't even put up a fight against Flint Howard's threat earlier. But still, Eliano couldn't trust Damien Rosanna enough to let him dictate her life. And who was Damien Rosanna? The Duke Rosanna and Eliano were born twins. When Marcel was striving to become emperor, Damien implored Eliano to support him, promising his and their father's help in turn. And just as he had promised, the Rosanna household provided unwavering support for Eliano and her husband. But the repercussions came almost immediately afterwards. Her family had helped her in her time of need, so they needed her help in return. Her family demanded that she dedicate herself to them as payment for the financial support they provided her and her husband. And Eliano couldn't refuse them because they were the only ones she could rely on. She stole classified information from the Emperor's office, copied military details, and gave them to spies, all at the whim of her family's request. But that family turned their back on her when she needed them the most. Eliano wrote letter after letter to Damien, her brother, once things started getting bad for her in Jakador. She wrote about Marcel's polygamy, about the poisoning, about the mockery she received for being barren. Eliano poured out her hearts, voiced her fears, begged her brother to help get a divorce with the Emperor. And what did Damien do to her desperate pleas? He berated her. A divorce? How could she possibly want to drag the Rosanna family through such shame, even with all the fortune the family had spent to help them in the past? Damien shunned her of the thought of divorce. He told her to endure the pain and not be weak. Eliano was shocked, devastated. But then, what had she really expected? In truth, her family had never cared about her well-being. And so, Eliano couldn't trust the family that betrayed her, nor their promises. But Eliano couldn't sleep. Flint Howard was a very convincing man, especially with his annoyingly sincere eyes. How could she doubt a man with eyes like that? Eliano gave it some thought. Could she really have a peaceful life? Just then, her thoughts were interrupted by the chief maid. She'd summoned Lady Vivian, a secret messenger, just as Eliano had ordered. Meanwhile, Grand Duke Howard Flint waited for Eliano at the Empress's palace greenhouse, like he'd promised. His guard was certain Eliano would not show up. He was rather more worried about the coming patrol and the risk it could do to their already fragile cover in the city. But suddenly, they sensed her presence. The Lady Vivian, cloaked in dark clothing that kept her as insidious as the night around them. She broke the news Flint's guard had already anticipated earlier on. Eliano wasn't coming. Flint Howard was too disappointed to speak immediately. Vivian warned him about the recent change in security and advised him to take a path she'd cleared for him through the defense. Eliano instructed him to cross the border as soon as possible. She gave him specific instructions on how to leave, insisting that he used a system of identity cards to get through different checkpoints in Ringskin, the place of his birth. Flint's guard wasn't having it. How could they trust a woman who just appeared out of the night with a box claiming to be sent by Eliano? It could be a trap. But Vivian wasn't done. She was asked to deliver the news that Vianteca's small son had lost its light. Eliano was never returning. The two men were stunned beyond words. She, however, thanked Flint for his sincerity and charged him to go back and become the Emperor of Vianteca. After delivering her message, the Lady Vivian left as mysteriously as she had come. Time passed after the incident, and it would seem that luck had finally smiled down on Eliano. She was pregnant. She was finally going to take breath, and all the threats of being stripped of her title would finally die. But her happiness did not last. The child died even before it got a chance to see the world. Eliano had a miscarriage. Eliano was heartbroken. She was inconsolable. After her miscarriage, Eliano cried for days in her palace. But Marcel had a different reaction to her situation. What was the point in spending nights with Eliano if she couldn't keep the child? That was what he had to say. As for Marcel, he felt his thoughts were justified. After all, he hadn't asked much of Eliano. All he wanted was a child. Even a daughter would have been okay. And just like that, talks of stripping her of her title began rising up again, making her feel pathetic and miserable. It felt like things couldn't get any worse. But they just kept escalating until it blew up in her face. The truth of Eliano's birth suddenly began to surface in the royal court. She was an illegitimate child. The nobles had a mouthful to say about her in disgust. They had served her as their empress because of her imperial bloodline, despite her lack of qualifications and her origins from an enemy empire. But to think she'd been an illegitimate child all along. That was totally unacceptable in their eyes. Eliano had to be stripped of her title. Since Jakador looked down on illegitimate children, there was no way a woman with such a background could be the empress. Eliano's maids advised her to give up her title honorably, to save her from the shame of open rebuke. But how could Eliano give up the title when it was all she had left? Her maids implored her to be reasonable and choose her life over honor. She had to find a way to survive. But for Eliano, it wasn't half as simple. As someone from Vianteca, she could only live and die by honor. Nothing else. She told the maids to stay away from her palace. It was almost time to end everything. That's what her survival instincts told her, but she couldn't have been more wrong. News came in from home. The Rosanna household Vianteca had been annihilated. The new emperor, Grand Duke Flint Howard, had commanded for the entire family to be wiped out. Everyone from the immediate family to the collateral family was killed without mercy. Could fate be any more cruel to Eliano? The once indomitable house of Rosanna had crumbled and was wiped out from the world. Her maids came to comfort her. What could they do? What if the new emperor tried to harm her too? Eliano was already resigned to her fate. She was a Rosanna too, and she'd already turned down the emperor's offer of help initially. She was now at his mercy. She made peace with her death. Eliano was sick and tired of losing control, but death was her only way out. However, even that was not in her hands. When the time came to strip her of her title, the emperor came visiting, showing her kindness he'd never offered before. It felt like they were back in Ringskin again, where he'd once declared his passionate love for her. For the first time in a long while, they shared an enjoyable conversation, and he was so affectionate that he even brewed the tea for her. It should have seemed too good to be true, but Eliano was desperate and lonely. She accepted the tea from him gladly. But the moment it slid down her throat, everything fell apart. She'd been poisoned. Again. Marcel stood over her dying figure and vowed to end her life, with a twisted aim of preserving her honor as Jakador's Empress. He felt justified. Eliano couldn't have had any regrets, not after she'd enjoyed all the riches and glory in her lifetime. Eliano was in disbelief, even as she gasped for breath. Seeing she was near her end, Marcel continued saying even more evil things to her. He said she should have turned down the title of Empress when he took the throne. And then came the hard part. He'd always been disgusted by her ambition. He also said that if she'd had a child, a male child, he might have succeeded him. The world blurted away around Eliano until she was trapped in the darkness of her own mind. She could merely hear the faint sound of Marcel's voice as he said, "Goodbye, my love." Such irony. When did things start to go wrong? Was it when she lost her child? Was it when she didn't give up the Empress title? Was it when she believed her husband's love would last forever? Was it when she turned down Flint Howard's offer? And then, as life slowly ebbed away from her, the realization hit her. Her misery had begun the moment she was sold off to Jakador. Eliano wished she could go back and resist, even if it meant getting beaten to death by her father. She wanted to undo everything, but it was too late. Or was it? It would appear fate was nowhere near done with her because when Eliano opened her eyes again, it was the spring of her 21st year. She was sitting in the temple when someone called her name. "Eliano!" Two ladies from the noble class approached her. One asked if she'd only recently turned down a proposal letter, while the other asked, with a hint of mockery of course, if she wanted to join the temple. Eliano ignored them and slipped her veil even lower over her face, leaving the duo in awkward silence. But her life flashed through her mind as she sat in the comfort of her own silence. Everyone assumed that she had it all simply because she was a Rosanna. They concluded that unlike other maidens, she was under no pressure to get married. One believed that Eliano's father, Duke Rosanna, regarded her choice when it came to choosing a husband. Another was so jealous that Eliano had a twin brother who cared for her. All they could see was the part of her life wrapped in the flashiest of things. They certainly couldn't see the abuse. Of course not. Her father policed her life down to the last detail. He made her after all, so he had the power to decide who could deflower her. He raised her to be a typical old-fashioned noble lady. To the ordinary eye, she was receiving the best education. But in truth, it was all just etiquette. A long list of do's and don'ts. When Eliano tried to learn something new by visiting the library, her father didn't buy into the idea. Instead, her tutor offered to get her more books and advised her to go visit the tailor. Little Eliano. She didn't know any better and was delighted at the prospect of seeing the tailor. One time she had to learn something new to pass her tests. She was dismayed to find that she couldn't get an answer to a question. But her tutor didn't think it was stressful. Eliano cried for fear that her father would be angry with her if he found out. So her tutor promised to hide the truth from her father and tell him that Eliano passed all her tests. Later that evening, Eliano received the whipping of her life for misconduct in front of her tutor. Her father had been listening the whole time. He vowed to make her suffer if she ever repeated the same mistake. As if that wasn't enough, he made her promise not to tell anyone of his crude disciplinary measures. Only then did she realize that she'd made a grave mistake. But did any of it really warrant being whipped till she bled? Poor Eliano. Eliano begged her father for forgiveness, and as expected, the Duke soaked in her submission and told her even more lies. He told her he was doing everything for her good and asked if he'd ever led her astray. So callously evil. So wrong. Eliano realized as the memories flooded back that her father was the genesis of her trauma. How could she forget? And now, by some miracle, she was given a second chance to make everything right. To rewrite her story. She vowed never to make the same mistakes from her past life. The steward announced the entry of Duke Rosanna as he entered into the hall with a beautiful lady by his side. Everyone wanted to know who she was. She obviously looked too young to be his wife, so they were left even more confused. Until someone who knew the family revealed her identity. Eliano Rosanna, the Duke's daughter. She also whispered and asked all who could hear to take note of Eliano's name, to remember her because she was the most noble flower of Vianteca's high society. Hushed words of gossip kept flying around as Eliano and her father walked down the aisle. Was she still single? Why was she with her father? She was rumored to be over 20 after all. But someone said that Eliano was so adored by her father that he'd vowed to keep her by his side forever, refusing the emperor's suggestion of marrying her off to the crown prince. Of course, there were the jealous gossips among the crowd, who deemed her a weak little crybaby. Some others thought a weak-minded woman like her could never be a fit for the crown prince. But just how much about Eliano did they know to have such terrible opinions of her? Elsewhere in the household of Duke Sanders, his daughter Liliana Sanders was spreading even more gossip about Eliano Rosanna. She spoke of how she'd heard that Eliano kicked another noble out of a tea party. Someone else echoed in agreement how they'd heard that she'd even gone as far as telling off a servant for spilling wine. Others found it strangely surprising and hard to believe that Eliano, meek and gentle as she was, could exhibit such toxic behavior. But Liliana was nowhere near done. She went on to mention how Eliano had told off a fellow noble, Lady Ritan, whose servant had spilled the wine. One listener couldn't believe that Eliano, who'd sooner take a poisoned glass of wine than utter a word in protest, was capable of such heavy allegations. Liliana went on to narrate her own version of the events that transpired in Marquis Persetton's mansion. The Lady Marquis had welcomed everyone to the tea party, and someone sitting at the table felt inclined to kick Eliano off the table. But Eliano flipped the scripts and had Lady Marquis kick the culprit off the premises instead. Even so, everyone made excuses for Eliano. Maybe Lady Hiran must have said something extremely rude to her. She couldn't have reacted unprovoked. The memories kept swirling around in Eliano's head. She thought the incident had been minor at the time, and everyone had only gotten worked up over nothing. She thought she'd been such a fool in the past and was amazed she'd been able to keep her place as an empress at all. She reckoned she should have been smarter and more alert to possibilities, or perhaps completely oblivious to everything. Another flashback. Someone broke through her train of thoughts, asking why she'd become a wallflower. It was none other than Liliana. They'd been the closest of friends in her past life. Their fathers introduced them when they were just girls, and Liliana would always come to her rescue anytime she was being bullied. She'd come seeking Eliano to tell her that the Duke Rosanna was meeting with her uncle. She also joked about losing Eliano to God since her friend skipped her invitation to tea parties to be in the temple. Eliano also jokingly asked her not to get upset and visit the temple whenever she wanted to. Liliana, forever her nosy self, began asking a question. She'd come to confirm for herself if Eliano had indeed kicked Lady Hiran out of the tea party. Eliano felt her choice of words were pretty exaggerated and pointed out that Lady Hiran had said she was uncomfortable, and Lady Pearlstein obliged her. Liliana was immediately upset. Her friend was being diplomatic with her answers. She wanted the raw details and even promised to tell the other ladies if they were the reason for Eliano's hesitations. But Eliano assured her that there was no need. They'd once been friends in the past, but she knew her friend was merely acting with her. She was secretly tired of being Eliano's nanny. Liliana argued that Eliano was misunderstanding her and that she'd never said anything of the sort in the past. But Eliano maintained her position. She said she'd tired Liliana out by acting like a child with all the crying. She said Liliana was right after all. Maybe her singleness was a result of her childishness. Liliana realized in horror that Eliano had caught wind of her gossip. She tried to explain, to blame it on the Lady Hiran, claiming that the latter hated Eliano. She asked how Eliano could trust anyone other than her. Eliano's memories came floating back. It was Lady Hiran who'd opened her eyes to see who Lillian truly was behind her back. Lady Hiran had advised her to stay away from Lillian Sanders. Eliano declared that Lady Hiran didn't hate, and on the contrary, it was her close friend, Lillian, who actually did. All she needed was an apology from Lillian to sort things out, and yet here her friend was, pressing her for some hot gossip about another noble lady. Pitiful. Eliano told her how it was such a shame that she might never have seen things for herself if Lillian hadn't begun gossiping about her. However, Eliano promised to wait for Liliana to return to her senses because she believed their 10 years of friendship was worth something at least. Without saying another word, Lillian turned on her heels and slowly walked out of the temple. Eliano called out while she was still in sight and advised her to stop associating with ladies who lacked etiquette because it could ruin her reputation. She pointed out that the ladies hadn't even cared to greet her when they came into the temple. Eliano, reliving her past memories and making different choices this time around, knew within her heart that the world around her was changing, and it was only just the beginning. She vowed to never let anyone dictate her life again. But wasn't it also trivial? After all she'd had to suffer in her previous life, what satisfaction was there really in winning a petty squabble? Eliano wanted more. She called the attention of a servant and asked to be taken to the guest room. She was welcomed by the presence of two interesting people, the Northern Grand Duke, Flint Howard, and the Crown Prince, Jerez Vianteca. Eliano greeted him with a bow as courtesy demanded, but the prince was too awestruck by her beauty to mutter an appropriate response immediately. After an eon of silence, the Duke called his attention back to reality, and Prince Jerez immediately apologized and asked Eliano to stand. Duke Howard further apologized and offered to excuse Eliano, himself and the Crown Prince, if she wanted to use the room. But Eliano shocked them with an apology of her own and quickly disappeared from their sights. She didn't stop to listen when the prince called after her. Instead, she banged the door on her way out, leaving the prince in stunned silence. He wondered if she'd really changed like the rumors had said. He turned around to ask Howard's opinion, but his friend too was gone somehow. The Crown Prince, Jerez Vianteca, was born to the Emperor late in life, so his father treasured him and named him as the sole successor. 7 years ago, the prince was sent as an emissary of peace to Jakador, but was unjustly detained and ultimately presumed dead. This filled his father with grief and rage, leading him to declare war on Jakador. The war lasted for as long as 3 years. But while he waged his war, the emperor secretly tried to establish another heir within the empire. Duke Rosanna jumped on the opportunity and produced a forgotten, illegitimate child of the emperor's. But the new successor could never be allowed to become the crown prince and was eventually kicked out of the palace. Then one day, the crown prince, initially presumed dead by everyone, showed up from nowhere after winning the 3-year war, his cousin standing gallantly beside him. But things would never be the same since the whole world knew now about the existence of another successor. Eliano knew all of this from her past life, so it infuriated her that instead of taking out their anger on the king for his infidelity, they turned on her, the daughter of Duke Rosanna. Eliano summed them up as pathetic. Eliano heard someone call her name from behind. Grand Duke Flint Howard. He told her that she didn't need to pay her respects to the crown prince since she was a noble herself. But Eliano wondered aloud if that was the only reason he'd stopped her. Then he reached out his hand, and there in his palm was her hairpin. Eliano feigned a blush and told him that she thought he'd laugh since it was an old-school manner of declaring interest in someone. But Flint, being very much the noble gentleman, jumped to her defense and said he knew she didn't drop it on purpose. Eliano confessed that she was moved by his kindness, but refused to take it back. She had many things to replace a broken hairpin after all. Flint was stunned to silence. Eliano further implored him not to try returning the hairpin, especially because of her father. Flint nodded in understanding and let her walk away. When Flint returned to meet Prince Jerez, the latter was slighted by his actions. Very disappointed, he asked his friend how he could fall for Eliano's trick. But Flint maintained that she hadn't dropped the hairpin on purpose, and that he'd only meant to return something so valuable to its owner. But he sounded more surprised to recount that she'd turned it down. Prince Jerez advised him not to return the hairpin to the Rosanna house, and Flint asked why. Prince Jerez angrily rebuked his friend for even considering it to begin with. He added that he didn't want Duke Rosanna treating Flint like his daughter's medal. As an old tradition in Vianteca, ladies would drop their belongings to get the attention of men they were interested in, hoping that they'd return the items to them to win their affection. The prince was still so bitter that Eliano had rejected him, even though their marriage had only been a political move suggested by his father, the emperor. He was enraged that it seemed to everyone that she'd really rejected him. Flint immediately recalled Eliano's words, "If you know my father, I believe you'll understand why." He wondered if that was what she really meant. Prince Jerez continued admonishing his friend. He warned him not to return to Duke Rosanna's house, to prevent rumors from flying that he'd fallen for Eliano as well. He advised him to throw the hairpin away immediately. Flint nodded and did as his friend had advised. Meanwhile, Eliano returned to her father's side at the banquet, and he advised her to go home since she looked tired. She meekly agreed. To the outsider, it might have seemed like he was protecting her, but he was just keeping her away so she couldn't do anything fishy late at night. The guard escorting her to the carriage, taking her home, tried to make small talk with her and asked if she'd argued with her friend, Lady Sanders. But Eliano knew he was only her father's spy. He was always watching her every move to report her to her father. She bluntly asked him if he was someone who had to answer all his questions, and the guard was stunned into silence. Now that Eliano was reliving her life, she realized just how much of his nosiness had been unpleasant and disrespectful. How could she have endured such in the past? The guard followed her right into the carriage and plonked right down across from her, a stupid grin on his face. Eliano ordered the guard to leave her carriage. But he flashed a weird grin and said it was his duty to protect her from danger. Eliano was having none of it. "What dangers are there in the capital?" she asked. The guard informed her that they had to pass by the slums on the way. Eliano calmly declared that her carriage would not pass by the slums, and even if it did, the guard was more useful on the outside of the carriage rather than inside. She asked what would happen if the people in the slums threw rocks at the carriage. Her point seemed to finally get home to the guard because he was stunned to silence. He got down and instructed the driver to begin moving the carriage immediately. Eliano heaved a sigh of relief, grateful to have her some privacy at last. She resolved to never make the mistakes from her past life by not marrying a prince from Jakador. But to succeed, she had to escape her father's prying eyes. The spies, all of them, starting with her nanny. Eliano outlined her plan in her thoughts. She resolved to keep away from tea parties and balls. She didn't need all the attention. Fortunately, Flint had heeded her advice and didn't return the hairpin. Since her father wanted to marry her off to the Jakador prince, a romantic scandal would be an absolute disaster. But even with that, Eliano dropped the hairpin on purpose to make a connection with Flint. Eliano recalled how in her past life, Duke Flint Howard had been the one who'd come to her rescue when the odds were against her. Now, she wanted to give herself the chance of holding the hand that gave her hope in the middle of her trouble. While she was still thinking about it, the maid brushing her hair pulled a little too hard and caused her to yelp in pain. The maid immediately apologized, but Eliano ordered to stop. The maid misinterpreted her instruction and reassured her that she'd be more careful while she proceeded to brush Eliano's hair. But Eliano, without warning, slapped the brush off the maid's hands, sending it flying across the floor. Eliano snapped and told the maid that she didn't want to have a maid who didn't listen to her. The maid was too stunned by her sudden outburst that all she could do was stutter in confusion. Eliano immediately ordered for her to be kicked out. The other maids were left in confused shock as they watched on in silence. The older nanny stuck her head into the room and asked what had happened. Eliano immediately reiterated for the maid to be taken away and never let into her room again. The older nanny scanned the room, and once her eyes fell on the hairbrush, she quickly put things together and bent to pick it up. At once, she instructed the erring maid to apologize. The poor maid, now in tears, apologized and explained that her hands had been aching lately. The older nanny quickly jumped to answer and said that Eliano understood her circumstances. Just as she was trying to encourage the maid not to worry too much, Eliano cut her short. She asked why the older nanny wouldn't listen to her, but was met with an irritated silence from the lady. Eliano went further to ask who the older lady's master was, and sure enough, the lady answered and told her that the Duke was the master. Eliano, frustrated that her nanny was trying to stall her efforts at establishing authority, said she didn't wish to argue with her. But the older nanny coolly said she'd only stated facts. Eliano turned around sharply in anger, startling the maid standing behind her. She pointed out one of them and instructed the lady to go and fetch the butler. The maid quickly stole a glance at the older nanny, who glared at her, silently daring her to do as she'd been instructed. Seeing as she was up against the real powers in the house, the maid stayed put. And there was a moment of tense silence. Eliano sighed as she realized no one was listening to her orders. She marched away at that moment to search for the butler herself. She bumped into a male servant who inquired to know what she wanted. Eliano demanded to see the butler, and the male servant explained that he was rather busy at the time. He implored her not to be stubborn. But this was a new Eliano. She wasn't taking orders from anyone. She hauled a flower pot sitting nearby and smashed it to pieces on the floor. The servant gasped in shock. Eliano wasn't perturbed at all and said she had no choice since he wasn't listening to her initially. Then she demanded to see the head butler again. Her meeting with the butler was very fruitful. Eliano fired all the maids and ordered them out of her house. The nanny was furious. She argued that she'd selected the maids herself, but Eliano's heart was as resolute as a rock. She was firing them anyway. She carried on as if to spite the old nanny and asked her if there was anything wrong. While they were still speaking, the head maid, Miller, arrived at the scene. She stated that even though the nanny had raised Eliano as a child, her orders were final. Even Jonathan, the head butler, agreed with Miller. After the maids had been seen out of the house, Eliano called Miller and instructed her to never bring clumsy or chatty maids to her room again. The older nanny, Pamela, was placed on indefinite probation for manipulating the other maids and disobeying Eliano. But Eliano knew the nanny wouldn't stay on probation for so long because she was on her father's side. She needed a plan to drive the lady out before her father intervened. But Eliano had other plans to attend to before that. She was disturbed by the presence of her sister Isabella, who strutted into the room uninvited. Of course, Eliano demanded an explanation for her rude intrusion. But Isabella offered her a smile instead as she greeted her. Eliano demanded to know why her sister had come into her room so rudely, but the latter giggled sheepishly, noting that Eliano had changed so much since the last time they saw each other. She added that Eliano had just sounded like their mother. Eliano kept silent. Isabella, who'd smacked a maid on her way in, asked Eliano if she was going to scold her because of that, and offered to let her hit one of her own maids instead. She also quipped that she doubted Eliano could do something as cruel as that. Eliano asked her to sit down at the table while a maid poured them both some tea. Isabella praised her sister's gracefulness and remarked that it seemed like she'd practiced the art her entire life. Eliano shrugged and asked if that wasn't the case. After all, they'd both had the same upbringing. But Isabella was quick to point out that their father wasn't as strict to her as he was with Eliano. Isabella eventually got down to the real reason she'd come. She announced that she'd be debuting in high society, but confessed that she couldn't show the level of grace her sister had because of her temper. Eliano cut her straight to it by stating that there had to be a reason why Isabella had come to see her in that regard. They were sisters, and so there was no need to skirt around the issue. Isabella immediately launched her agenda to Eliano's hearing. She'd heard that Pamela was on probation and that the order had come from Eliano and not their father. Isabella commended her and said that keeping Pamela around wouldn't have served her any good. Eliano asked Isabella what she thought, and her sister leaned in closer, a mischievous smirk on her face. She asked Eliano if she wanted to get rid of old Pamela for good and offered to help. Eliano couldn't tell why her sister was so interested, so she declared that Pamela's probation was going to stay that way until she decided otherwise. But Isabella pointed out that everything could change once their father got involved. Eliano could already picture old Pamela rubbing it in her face that she couldn't be gotten rid of so easily. She had no choice. Eliano accepted her sister's offer and inquired to know how she hoped to get the job done. Rather than give an outright answer, Isabella flashed a knowing smile at her sister. Isabella assured her that she'd take care of Pamela, but only in exchange for a favor from Eliano. All she wanted was for Eliano to help her take out Marquis Alvich, the man her father wanted her to marry, from the imperial ball the following day. Eliano was stunned by her sister's request. She asked if Isabella wanted her to hire someone to kill him. But Isabella had other plans. She said all she wanted was for Eliano to make him propose to her instead. Eliano weighed the odds and decided that her Pamela problem was better within her control than her sister's absurd request. Isabella pleaded fiercely, saying she didn't want to marry the noble her father had picked for her. She begged Eliano to just dance with him at least, and in return she promised to help her sister when she really needed it. Eliano gave it some thought. She wasn't close to her sister, but she knew her sister never went back on a promise. She began considering the dance. But there was a slight challenge. What were the odds that a Marquis heir would propose to her after just a dance? Would he really be that foolish? But Eliano needn't have worried. In fact, Marquis Alvich was literally drooling when he saw her. He confessed and said how honored he was to be able to talk to her, even going as far as attributing their meeting to the works of an unseen fairy. Such a cloudhead. He also commented on her frequent visits to the temple and praised her being devout. He really was a fool in every sense of the word. A lovesick puppy. For a second, Eliano considered marrying him just before her father had the chance to send her off to Jakador. But she didn't see that happening. She endured the dance a little longer, and everyone who saw her was amazed. They couldn't believe their eyes. Was she looking for someone to marry? And so, many more hands went up, all asking to have a dance with Lady Rosanna. Eliano entertained their frenzied requests with a plastic smile, vowing under her breath to make Isabella pay for setting her up in such a manner. At the close of day, Eliano returned home, only annoyed to find the surprise of old Lady Pamella's presence in the house. Pamela greeted her with a hint of malice hidden beneath her fake smile. Eliano queried her, saying she didn't recall lifting the probation she'd placed on the old lady, but quickly put things together and figured she was back on her father's orders. Pamela flashed her a sinister smile and said she couldn't be far from her, not even for a second. After all, who else could make Eliano into a perfect lady? Eliano quietly sat and let her nanny groom her hair like the old times. Pamela noticed that her hair roots had grown a lot and reasoned that if the real color of Eliano's hair was discovered, people would question her lineage. Eliano silently let her mind travel back down memory lane. She'd always been curious about the color of her hair, and anytime she asked Pamela, the older lady was always quick to tell her that she'd been born without color, a rare disease of some sort. And Eliano, poor Eliano, had believed her, because in the past her life revolved around her beloved nanny. But soon the secret behind the color of her hair came to light. A message was delivered from the house of Vianteca through the Empress, demanding that an heirloom Eliano had always worn for as long as she could remember be returned to them. They claimed it was left behind by the late Duchess, and Eliano, as an illegitimate child, had no business having it in her possession. At first, when Eliano read the letter, she dismissed it as one of her brother's many mischievous pranks. A magical object that changed one's hair color? How ridiculous that sounded. She handed the letter off to a maid and instructed her to burn it. Because she ignored the letter, an official complained and followed it shortly after. The letter demanded that she, an illegitimate child, return the family heirloom belonging to the Duchess's treasury at once. The letter warned her to return the treasure and repent from her sins. And that was when Eliano remembered. As a girl, she'd always worn the earrings without question, until one day, Pamela took them off and instantly her hair changed color. Pamela promised to protect the artifact and resort to dyeing Eliano's hair to maintain the secret of her lineage. Eliano recalled sending a letter up to Vianteca, requesting for Pamela to be interrogated instead. But it was already too late. The whole country knew she was an illegitimate child. Poor Eliano. So it all made sense. Marcel's malice was born from the fact that Eliano dared to marry him after stealing his family's heirloom. Eliano was shattered. Her noble lineage had been a lie all along, and she was disgraced as a thief. Judgment poured in from every corner, and everyone was fed up having an illegitimate child as the Empress. All the effort Eliano had poured into retaining her title as Empress, it all started to crumble. Eliano's thoughts drifted back to reality when the nanny announced that she was done dyeing her hair. Eliano casually commented that Pamela could run a hair-dyeing business after she'd retired, but Pamela was quick to state that there was no way she'd ever retire since she was always going to serve beside Eliano. Then she gently asked if Eliano was going to bed. Eliano let her nanny tuck her into bed and listened silently while the older lady slunk away. Eliano was appalled by the lady's pretense. Alone to herself, Eliano realized that the magical object had always been the genesis of her misery. If only she'd returned it when the first letter from Vianteca had come, then maybe no one would ever have known the truth about her lineage. And maybe, just maybe, she might never have lost her title. But Eliano also wondered where her old nanny could have placed the artifact. Did she always have it in her possession? Or did she hide it away in her room? Or had she sold it already? Eliano snapped out of her spiraling thoughts and reminded herself that the priority was getting Pamela kicked out of the house. She made a mental note to meet with Isabella and find out how things were going. She made her way to her sister's room and was welcomed by a gleeful Isabella. It was her first time visiting her sister, and Eliano instantly realized that her sister's room was so glamorous. She quickly brushed off the initial awe and settled down on a couch, ready to discuss business. She asked the maids to leave. Isabella also instructed the maids to keep their meeting a secret, especially from the head nanny, Pamela. Once they were alone, Isabella quickly remarked that Eliano had played her part well in getting Marquis Alvich's attention off her. She teased Eliano, saying Alvich was probably so into her already. Eliano shrugged and shifted the focus back to her mission. She asked Isabella how she planned to get rid of the nanny. Isabella confidently reassured her that she had a way. She waved a fancy pen in the air and said that all they needed to do was chase out a thief. Eliano immediately got the idea. She also recognized the pen at first glance. It was Damien's. Isabella was certain that the pen would be tracked down, so she assured Eliano to wait and promised to get the job done on the day their brother would leave. Eliano remarked that the plan was good, but she was skeptical that it might not work because Pamela had served the family for a very long time. Isabella raved about how difficult it had been getting her brother's property for the job. Their father's would have been impossible to get. Eliano suggested they use something from their mother's instead, but Isabella immediately pointed out that it would be a Herculean task. Then Eliano dropped a bombshell. Would it be easier if the item had been stolen already? Isabella's eyes widened in excitement and surprise as she put things together. She asked if Pamela was really a thief after all. Eliano had to quieten her before her excitement sold them away. Then Isabella asked what Pamela had stolen. Eliano told her about the heirloom and its magical powers. Isabella offered to search Pamela's room for the artifact. But then they were faced with another challenge. What if it had already been sold? Eliano stared silently, a sliver of resolute hope in her eyes, before she said Pamela wouldn't have sold the artifact if she really valued her life. Their father would never let her live if he found out she'd sold it. So with that sorted out, Eliano made her exit from Isabella's room. But just as she got outside the door, Eliano felt a hand grab her firmly by the arm, and she snapped her head around to find Pamela. The nanny informed her that her father was looking for her and asked for them to head to meet him together. Eliano moved silently to her father's study, barely believing she was coming there again even in her second life. Horrible images of her past ordeals within the walls of that very room flashed through her mind. The tears, the pleas for mercy. Then her father's voice broke through her thoughts. He announced that Marquis Alvich had sent in a proposal. And of course, the Duke wasn't pleased with this development. So he asked if Eliano had seduced him. Eliano stuttered as she quickly stated her innocence. Her father angrily demanded to know what on earth then would have prompted Marquis Alvich to propose to her. Then Eliano confessed that she'd only danced with him and done nothing else. Her father glared angrily at her and said that Pamela had noticed she'd become strange, and now he's just confirmed for himself because she dared to talk back to him. And of course, creepy old Pamela was quick to quip that Eliano needed to be taught a lesson, her lips curling up with a sinister smirk. As if to worsen the horror of the moment, the Duke agreed with her. He immediately instructed Pamela to hang Eliano. Eliano protested and struggled to wrestle her arm free from the old nanny's firm grip. Her defiance earned her a resounding slap. Eliano yelped in agony as she fell to the floor. Duke Rosanna brandished a whip and vowed to make sure Eliano never talked back to him ever again. Isabella stood outside the study, her patience running thin as the seconds ticked away. She demanded to see her father, but the steward standing in front of the door tried to restrain her from gaining entry. She tried to push her way into the room, but stopped dead in her tracks at the sound that welcomed her. Eliano's voice rang through the air as she cried for mercy, pleading for her father's forgiveness. Isabella called out to her sister in shock. The steward moaned helplessly, saying that was why he denied her entry into the study, because the Duke was disciplining Eliano. Isabella was shocked. She wondered how any of what she was looking at could be termed discipline. She recalled in her heart that she'd been disciplined by their father, even whipped with a stick. But the sound she could hear didn't sound anything like a stick. It sounded heavier, more vicious. Eliano received assault after assault as the whip tore away at her flesh with every strike from her father. Her body was a roadmap of bloodied scars. Duke Rosanna finally took a break from the round of assaults, his chest heaving from the effort as he asked if Eliano was ever going to disgrace him and seduce a man in the future again. Isabella heard that much and was horror-stricken to realize that she was the reason why her sister was enduring such torture. She lifted her hand to push her way into the room, but she was stopped by a familiar voice. Her brother, Damien Rosanna, slowly walked up to her, a stern frown on his face. Isabella snapped at him, asking what he wanted, but Damien calmly reiterated that he'd asked her not to enter the room. Isabella realized immediately that her brother had always been aware of this so-called discipline their father meted on Eliano, meaning this wasn't the first time. Isabella, livid with her brother, demanded to know how he could let such a thing happen to his other half. But Damien cut her off mid-sentence, an indifferent shrug in his gait as he casually mentioned that he and Eliano were supposed to be twins. But he was about to reveal a secret Isabella hadn't known the whole time. Eliano wasn't his twin, and neither was she Isabella's sister. Isabella was stunned, speechless. Damien continued by saying they were nothing alike except for the color of their eyes, and proceeded to ask Isabella if she never had any doubts. Isabella didn't care. She still thought their father was being mean to Eliano. Damien maliciously asked her what she was going to do to change things, and if she was going to trade places with Eliano. Isabella was left in a fix, silent as her anger and frustration built up. She clenched her hands into fists by her side. Damien told her not to act rashly if she didn't wish to do anything because he didn't want their father to put his hands on her too. Isabella could do nothing but sob as she resigned to fate. Damien turned to the steward who'd witnessed the whole scene and instructed him to take Isabella to her room and keep silent about her ever coming close to the study door. The steward bowed obediently and did as he'd been told. The sound of Eliano's voice still seeped out through the door as she begged for forgiveness. Damien sucked his teeth in irritation and further instructed for nobody to be let through the hallway. Inside the study, the Duke was done inflicting his wrath on Eliano, and the nanny took her away to her room. The maids who saw her all gasped in horror at the patchwork of ripped flesh that was now her skin. They offered to call her a doctor immediately, but Pamela violently dismissed them, declaring that Eliano was hers. Unbelievable. She said she'd treat Eliano and ordered the other maids to leave. They quickly scrambled away while Pamela slammed the door shut in the wake of their exit. She vented under her breath about firing the new maids Eliano had employed. She walked up to Eliano's weak form laying on the bed, a sinister smile on her face. She mused aloud and said there had to be something in Eliano's blood, something vulgar, which was most likely why Marquis Alvich confessed that he couldn't forget their night together. But she couldn't find any trace of intimacy on Eliano's body, so she wondered just what she'd done to the young noble to have him swooning over her like an adoring puppy. Did Eliano give him her lips? Pamela grabbed Eliano, violently scratching an open wound on her forearm. Eliano let out a weak sound in agony. Pamela held up the medicine the Duke had prepared for treating Eliano, a sinister smirk on her face as she admitted that the Duke really loved her. She also added that she didn't want to leave a scar on Eliano's body. But she deviously declared she wasn't going to treat Eliano this time as punishment for looking down on her. She covered her up and turned to leave, looking over her shoulder as she said she'd see Eliano in the morning. Eliano must have seen it all coming. She'd imagined time without number how she'd leave the room whenever her father wanted to hurt her rather than stay put in helplessness. But she'd lost her resolve the moment she saw the whip in her father's hand. Because the truth remained that even though she'd endured so much pain, she'd never really learned to overcome physical suffering. She realized devastatingly that nothing could save her, not even becoming Jakador's Empress. She had to escape from her father first. By morning of the following day, Isabella marched down the hallway to Eliano's room. A maid tried to keep her from entering the room, but Isabella violently pushed her out of the way, sending her to the floor in a heap. Pamela stuck her head out, her face contorted in an annoyed frown as she queried Isabella for entering the room without permission. But it'd appear she didn't realize she was talking to Isabella, and once she did, she stuttered hesitantly. Isabella marched up to her, her footsteps thumping against the floor like a war drum, and then she roared angrily in Pamela's face, demanding to know why the old nanny tried to talk her down. She quickly followed her query with a resounding slap that sent Pamela crashing to the floor. Pamela looked up, her face contorted in rage as she planned a retaliation. Isabella felt insulted. Had the nanny lost a screw or two? She asked her how she could make the mistake of looking straight at her in the manner she had, her hand moving involuntarily to land a slap across her face. Then she lifted her eyes up to the bed and saw Eliano's battered form, still unconscious. She'd come in with a physician who'd already begun her assessment on Eliano. They were shocked to find Eliano's body was still bloodied. The physician remarked that Eliano hadn't even been treated yet and got down to work immediately. Isabella paused, stunned by the revelation. She slowly turned around to face Pamela, who was still licking her wounds on the floor, and demanded to know if what the physician had said was true. And that's where we'll pause for today. If you're curious to see what happens next, be sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss any updates. Let me know in the comments if you'd like to see part 2. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next recap.